How you doing, people? Give me a one if you can hear me. Like a whole new setup. I need to make sure that you can all hear me before I get started. Let me know if you can hear the music too, please. Okie dokie. Thank you. Correo de dinero. De dinero. How's my link? That's the other thing. My Wi-Fi is the worst. Oh, wait till I move. Wi-Fi is not the best in this area. Anyway, it's good. Okay, let's get started. Let me not waste your time. You guys hear the music as well? Okay. Let me fade the music. Okie dokie. Good evening, everybody. Good evening. Good to see people here. I'm gonna get started. Hopefully, people will come in as it starts. Couple of announcements. So we're live on Twitter. I didn't even know that was possible until today. Live on Twitter, live on YouTube. And a couple of things. Firstly, if you haven't subscribed, please make sure you subscribe. Please make sure Tylog says he was jamming. Kwame Olatuji, my brother, good to see you. Mr. Siad, good to see you. So just a couple of things. If you haven't subscribed, please. I would like to do my very best to continue doing these lives. I'm having a bit more fun with them. Thank you so much for the feedback regarding the previous lives we've been doing. On uncomfortable spot here. Oh well. But I'm very grateful that you guys be tuning in. Kwame, good to see you, my brother. I'm very well. Thank you very much. It was my birthday a couple weeks ago, so But anyway, we'll talk. So the topic today, excuse me. Topic today. As you can see from the what do I call it? The thumbnail, excuse me. I have 6 images of 6 different people, 6 iconic characters, if you will. Top left, Malcolm X. Directly beneath him is, if you want to call him oops, let me go back. If you want to call it his adversary. Somebody's asking me what my birthday age is. Don't worry, almost 40. That's all you need to know. Almost, not yet. David Oyelowo playing Martin Luther King. Malcolm X playing, Denzel Washington playing Malcolm X. You have Jimoh Hunsu and Lupita Nyong'o. Jimoh Hunsu obviously is an actor from Benin by way of France. Lupita Nyong'o is an actor from Kenya by way of Mexico. I don't even know the Mexico part. I think she was just born there, but whatever. The 2 on the right, Sam Jackson in Django and Morgan Freeman in Amistad. Now, there's a reason why I've put these images. The main reason is, obviously, the topic says, let me remove myself. The topic says, no, that's not what I wanted to do. The topic says, slavery was your fault too. Who am I talking to? Essentially, I'm coming to a point, which I will get to at the very end. There's a question I need to ask everybody, particularly my African-American brothers and sisters. Because there's this thing going around that people just seem to say that the problem with slavery is Africans sold Africans into slavery, and that the Europeans were the ones that saved black people from being that helped. Start again. Let me calm down. That stopped slavery from continuing. Now, this isn't true, and because it's not true, we have to try and dispel these myths. So, what I'm trying to show here is essentially actors of direct African descent. So actors of direct African descent, David Oyelowo, Jimoh Hunsu, Lupita Nyong'o, who are obviously African. We know Denzel, Morgan Freeman, and Sam Jackson are obviously from the United States. But the question I'm trying to pose here is, when did we stop being African? Now I'm talking specifically about my Caribbean people and my people in the Americas. At what point did you stop being African? Because if you're saying to yourself that there are Africans who sold Africans into slavery, and the people that were enslaved are the African Americans, at what point did we all stop being slavery? What point did we all stop being African? So let's go into detail. Let's go. All right. People are saying it. D's asking who's saying that. People have been saying it, particularly in. I posted a video a few weeks ago where I was basically explaining that slavery or the enslavement period in general was something that we are all part and parcel of, that we're all victims of, and that we're also culpable for. So what I want to just show you here, if you look at the image that you have on the screen, essentially we're looking at what Africa looked like. So this is the year 1625. This is a rough estimate of what Africa looked like. So if you look at what Africa looks like today, these maps are very different. Of all the countries that, in fact, when you look at Mali, where Mali is, there's a bit more territory that they have today. So what you call Mali today is not what you see on the map there. It's a bit bigger. Morocco is still there, but it's further west and to the north. The rest of them, if you look particularly to the right-hand side, where you see Oyo, Benin, Igala, Jukun, Nupe, Borgu, Zamfara, Katsina, all of those different nationalities make up Nigeria today. Right? So we are looking at a very, very diverse continent. And this is just the sub-region. This is just the Western African part. These are the kingdoms that existed circa 1625. Let's move on. This is a map, I believe, from 1707 that was sketched by some Portuguese people. So you could see how things have changed just over a little under 100 years. You can see the various maps. Look further down. This is where the Dahomey Kingdom has become more prominent. So right at the bottom of your screen, what they call the Guinea Coast. They used to call this the Guinea Coast, hence why we have so many countries called Guinea. We have Guinea-Bissau, Equatorial Guinea, we have Guinea-Conakry, right? So they called this the Guinea Coast, right? So you have Royaume de Dahomey. For any of you who've seen my documentary, Royaume du Benin, excuse me. For any of you who've seen my documentaries about the Dahomey Kingdom, obviously from the movie The Woman King, you could see how it came about, essentially as a result of slavery or the enslavement period. Let's move on a little bit. This is the year 1880. 1880 obviously is the time when the so-called enslavement period has been ended by the French and the Belgians. Most European nations had stopped enslaving people officially, even though they were still coming to the west coast of Africa and stealing people. Now, what is interesting about the map is how it's developed over time. Is that if you look at some of the kingdoms that existed, they were all beginning to come under the control of either the Belgians, the French, the British, the Italian, the Germans. So essentially, we are seeing this is in 1880. 4 to 5 years later, you have the Berlin Conference, which is really when they decided, okay, I'm going to take this, and then I'm going to go in and control them. So we're seeing how Africa is slowly crumbling at this point. Now, let me get to my points. I need to remove myself. How do I remove myself from this place? Okay. Anyway, I'll keep it there for now. Okay, so a couple comments. Keep the comments coming. I'll go through them in a minute. I have quite a long show. I've been preparing it for a couple of days. So I apologize to those of you who didn't see this earlier. It was supposed to be on yesterday, but I had a little issue with my children, so I didn't do it. But anyway, let me just go through the details. By today's terminology, in today's language, what we say is that everybody on the African continent is African. Okay? Now, as you have seen from the three maps that I showed you, at the time period before the Europeans arrived, even really before the Europeans started to trade with us, the concept of Africa, the concept of the continent just wasn't a thing. Nowhere really in the world did people start thinking about continents, okay? But by today's terms, when we say, okay, Africa, land of black people, whatever, we say that by today's terms, everyone in Africa is considered to be an African. Now, of course, in the north, you have the Berbers. You also have the Arab invaders that came with the Umayyad Caliphate in the 600s. These are the people that came and conquered North Africa. In their minds, they consider themselves Africans. And so Africa is this broad, generic term. But really, when we're talking about Africa, we're talking about the people, If you want to say south of Egypt, south of Tunisia, south of Morocco, as you go south, that is really where Africa, in terms of its people, begin. But what I'm trying to explain here, is not about who the people are. It's just the generic term for people that live on this continent, these black people. Now, really, at that time, as we've seen from the previous maps, and I'm going to go back so that you understand what I mean. This isn't about ethnicity I'm talking about. I'm saying that these people saw themselves in, so let me even go back further. These people saw themselves as Mali, Mossi, Songhai, Morocco, Mazini, etc., etc. They saw themselves in terms of nationalities. The continent as a whole, you have to think about this. You read the accounts of Ibn Battuta, who is a traveler who traveled across the Songhai Empire, one of the great empires of Africa, one of the last great empires. What he was saying is, it took 6 months to go from one side to the other. Now, just so you know, the empire of Mali, or Songhai, if you will, stretches from where you can see where Mali is on the map, all the way to where Songhai is, and even further. They used to call it, in fact, in history, they refer to that part as the Western Sudan. Sudan, if you know, in Islam, in Arabic, Bilal Sudan, land of the blacks. But today we know it as one nation south of Egypt. But really, they refer to this whole area as Western Sudan. It also included Kanem Borno in northern Nigeria, etc., etc. But I just want to show you that these people were thinking in terms of nationality. The whole continent, the continental wide view wasn't really there, quite simply because people were saying, this whole continent up here is mostly black people. We kind of see white people here and there, but it's not as if people are traveling extensively. This isn't today. This isn't the world of Instagram. This isn't the world of even mass education, where people are like, oh, there's this country, there's that country. Certainly people were educated, but not in the way that we discussed today. So the idea of being an African or being a continental place, they weren't thinking like that. So let me go back to my point. Now, people went to war with their neighbors. People went to war with their neighbors, as all people still do today. And I always use this, and I'm going to bring myself back up just so you can see. Europeans are at war today with their neighbors. You have the Ukrainians and the Russians fighting a war. If you go back to the Second World War, in fact, go back to the First World War, you essentially had a war that was fought between cousins. Tsar Nicholas of Russia, King of England, and Kaiser Wilhelm of Germany, from the Prussian states, which made up Germany. Those three went to war with each other in the First World War. Now, that is not even unusual. People who live close to each other fight against each other. They battle over territory. They have skirmishes. For those of you who have children, you see your children bicker and fight all the time. This is a common occurrence. So when I say to you that, people went to war with their neighbors, as all people still do today, let's not look at Africa as if it's a special case. We did this. People, Dahomey and the Oyo obviously became a very important part, war around in the enslavement period. But we will because of the way we've been taught this history, we make it seem like, oh my God, this is just some war to enslave. But it's more nuanced than that. Now, Africans were not naive, right? We were not naive, nor did we have an agenda against our neighbors who looked just like us. Okay, we weren't naive about that, right? We didn't have an agenda. We didn't say, yes, there was an area of, oh, we're better than these people, we're superior to these people, but it wasn't a racial superiority. Remember, enslavement happened. People were being enslaved around the world, and I'll come to that in a second. But when enslavement was happening because there was an absence of prisons. So when people went to war, usually the captives of war were taken. In many cases, they were even allowed to be part of the family. In fact, they could rise to higher positions in the society. So this is what we call the indentured servitude. And I've talked about this on this channel. I did a live on it, and I also mentioned it in one of my documentaries. I think the Dahomey and Vodun documentary. So it's very important to understand. Now, this is what a famous writer writing in the 1500s explained Africa as. He said Africa was a vast land surrounded by three oceans: the Atlantic and Indian Oceans of water, and then the Saharan Ocean of sand. Okay, it's not very accurate in that sense, but what they're basically trying to explain is you have the Atlantic Ocean around the west coast, you have the Indian Ocean on the eastern coast, and then you have the Sahara Desert, which essentially separates Africa from the conquered regions of the north where the Arabs arrived. Cities dealt with cities, rulers dealt with rulers for trade. Now, those who had access to the Mediterranean, this is obviously the time of the Moorish period. I'm talking of pre-slavery now, so we're now around the 1400s, 15th century. The Moorish period, those who were in the Mediterranean were trading with people in Spain, trading with people in Asia. The Mediterranean, of course, was the key waterway that connected three different continents. Those who were further south, maybe in the western lands of southern lands of West Africa, of course, this is the land of gold. You had the empire that was called Ouagadougou, which is incorrectly called Ghana. In fact, the king was called they called the Kayamagan. He was called the King of Gold. This was a man who was responsible for regulating the gold trade. That empire was eventually taken on by the Soninke people, and it became the Mali Empire. Then it became the Songhai Empire, etc. But gold was the main thing, and eventually the Gold Coast took over that particular region. Okay, when the Songhai Empire disintegrated. So some were dealing with gold, some were dealing with silk, some were dealing with this, some were dealing with that. And those who had access to the Europeans, the few Europeans in the Mediterranean, when things will eventually come south, that's what they would trade. Of course, Islam has now come in, and there are some who are traveling for pilgrimage to Mecca in Saudi Arabia. And so those ones are obviously going and bringing back things and communicating with people in the north about their lands further south. But no one was ever, and I must stress this, no one was ever able to conquer the lands south of the Sahara until much later when the enslavement was over. Now, trade of humans was not a major source of trade. Yes, there was indentured servitude, but some people, and I'm not talking to the people in this chat clearly. I'm talking to the people who think that slavery somehow was something we in Africa just did. It was just the thing we did. No. The empires that existed certainly had their own form of indentured servitude. In fact, I would argue that in Africa today, indentured servitude in some way still exists. It's a form of control where there is some remuneration, sometimes not, but certainly you're allowed to come out of the family. In fact, I'll give you the example I always like to cite is if you read Things Fall Apart by Chinua Achebe. Okonkwo, the kingdom of, the Umofia, which is the town of Okonkwo, his community, somebody is killed, and they go and negotiate with the town who's responsible for killing this person, an innocent girl, I think it was. I think the town is called Mbanefo, I think it's called, excuse me. They go and negotiate, and instead of going to war, they say, okay, you know what? You give us one virgin girl and one boy. And what ended up happening is Okonkwo, who went to negotiate, was given the boy, and the virgin girl was given to the man who lost his, I think it was his daughter. So essentially, they were brought in, and if you look at even the way Okonkwo treated his son, or his adopted son, he was essentially like his blood. There are many examples of this, by the way. Look at the Ethiopian that goes and joins the armies that eventually go and conquer India, and his name by the name of Ganges. They eventually name the river Ganges after him. This is a common theme across the world. Slavery certainly existed across the world, and it was in the form of indentured servitude. This whole chattel thing comes much later. Now, What was slavery in the 15th century? Because this is the era that we're going to be dealing with now. The 15th century. I want to talk about the transatlantic route. Okay, we're not talking about the Arabs. I might touch on it a little bit, but I've done it in a previous post. But this is specifically about what eventually became the so-called transatlantic slave trade. Well, we had a Christian a slave trade that involved Christians in the area that is known as the Black Sea. Coincidentally, the Black Sea is where the Ukrainians and the Turks, two places which are filled with conflict at the moment. Turkey obviously had their big earthquake the other day, and Ukraine is obviously fighting a war with Russia. But this particular region, there was a slave trade in the 15th century of Christians, largely by Genoese traders from the island of Genoa. Genoa is later the place where Napoleon, if you know the story of Napoleon, Genoa became a very important place for him. But in Africa, slaves could almost begin climbing the ladder of liberation from their rightless condition. And when I say rightless, I mean in the sense that they may not have had the same level as rights as the people who owned them, but certainly they were able to climb out of it. This whole idea that they're 3/5 of a human being is an American concept. Okay, American, European concept. And it wasn't much different for the captives who were brought from Africa. So I'm gonna talk about this in a second. The ones that were brought from Africa and brought into Europe early, these first few enslaved people from Africa. And now I'd like to go and explain how it began. Now, there is, again, as I always stress, it's important to read. I don't claim to be a genius at anything. I'm just somebody who studies and uses my own common sense. This is a book that's very useful. It's called The African Slave Trade by Basil Davidson. One of the few Europeans who tends to write from a historical perspective. A few others don't, unfortunately. So how did it begin? Excuse me. Now, the year 1492 is crucial in history. Why? Because that's the year that Christopher Columbus has his first voyage to the New World. But 50 years before that, 51 years to be precise, you have a period where a man called King Henry, or Prince Henry, excuse me, in history they call him Henry the Navigator, but in the words of John Henry Clark, the man he didn't know anything. Now, the Moors, if you understand anything about the Moors, these were the African people and Arab people. I'm not saying that they were completely African, but African and Arab people in the name of Islam that conquered the Iberian Peninsula circa 711, the year 711. And for about a period of nearly 800 years, they had control of numerous cities around what we would call Spain today. Cordoba, Sevilla, and also many different cities. They went even as far north as France, and they were stopped by, I forget the name of the French commander, at a place called Tours. If you know the famous story of the Battle of Tours, they were stopped there, although they could have kept going. In fact, it was really because the reason why they didn't keep going north is because they had to go back to Mecca to decide on who was going to take over after the Sultan had passed away. But that's another story. Anyway, long story short, by the year 1441, their power in Spain had started to decline. They'd started to lose because they never really had the whole of Spain. You see, it's different when you colonize or conquer an entire area and you have complete control over it. No, essentially what they did is they had to do, and I've done a live on this before, I think. You have to check it out. 2 lives actually talking about this. They essentially had to do trade with Jews and Christians and people, and they basically brought in a culture that people adopted, but they never dominated the society. So that's why over time the Spanish were able to consolidate their power and reconquer their entire land. By 1441, they were very close to taking the whole thing. So Henry the Navigator, using the information that he'd learned, his people had learned from the Moors, because remember, the Moors come over the Mediterranean Sea into the Iberian Peninsula. And because of that, they were obviously master seafarers. They controlled the Mediterranean. At that point, the Mediterranean was essentially like the main highway that you needed in this world to be able to keep doing business. Because you can go east to Asia, you go north to Europe, you go south to Africa. So it was crucial. So this information was obviously taught at the first school of navigation in Portugal. And so many seafarers began, including the likes of Columbus, etc. But there's this one particular story that really kicks off the African involvement in enslavement in Europe. 1441, a little ship, we call it a little ship, this is how historians describe it, under a young captain, a man by the name of Antão Gonçalves, okay, Portuguese, sailed to the western shore of Africa. Now, the western shore of Africa, it's very easy to confuse that and say West Africa. See, West Africa is, we tend to refer it as further south to where it is. Northwest Africa includes Morocco, Western Sahara, as you can see. In fact, if you know anything about Morocco, Morocco has been petitioning to join ECOWAS, which is the West African sub-region, doing this for the purpose of trade, obviously. But anyway, we won't deal with that now. So he was sailing to the western shore of Africa. Now, if you also know from geology, also I've mentioned it in my documentary about the, what's the documentary I mentioned this in? If you check out my documentary, The Rise of Islam in Mali, I think it was, I explained that there's this current. There's a current that takes you off the Senegambia coast and takes you into the Gulf of Mexico. This is a current which was proven even in the 1960s. A man called Thor Heyerdahl, he was like, oh my God, how are these Africans able to sail 600, 700 years ago? And he used a papyrus reed boat with an engine. The engine broke on the first or second day, and they still ended up in the Gulf of Mexico. There's also another current around this area called the Canary Islands. If you know the Canary Islands, it's the islands of Lanzarote, Fuerteventura, what's the other island? Las Palmas, all these different islands make up the Canary Islands, now controlled by Spain. But at the time, these were just independent islands. So he's sailing from the Iberian Peninsula, and there's a current that normally takes them there, but it takes you, there's a particular north wind that takes you back at a certain time. It's, the world works in cycles. So you have 6 months of it flowing one way, 6 months of it flowing the opposite way. Now, as they are moving, as they are trying to go back, now the purpose of what they were doing is to go there and get the oils, these oils that they were going in mid-Atlantic. You could get those oils from whales. You could get them from what they called sea beasts. Okay, so sea lions, etc. They would get these oils from them and then take them back, and that was a big trade. They made a movie about it with the guy who plays Thor. I forget his name, but they made a movie about this a few years ago. Now, the ill-timed north winds on their way back meant that they landed in a place called Rio de Oro. Rio de Oro, if you know anything about this part of Africa, is actually called Western Sahara today. Western Sahara is actually what was once called Spanish North Africa, Spanish Morocco, if you will. It's now under the control of Morocco. It's sort of an autonomous region that's part of Morocco, but it's its own independent country. Well, not independent country, but it's its own nation. A lot of the refugees from that place who wanted to resist Spanish occupation live away from Western Sahara in places like Mauritania. But these, for the most part, are largely Black people, what in America you could call Black people. Okay? So these winds forced them to land at a place called Rio de Oro. Now, for a Portuguese mariner at the time, they've never come this far south at the time. Not by sea. They'd never come this far south. And they thought to themselves, oh my God, in fact, this is the terminology this was the words that we used. Oh, how fair a thing it would be if we were to bring the first captives before the face of our prince. In other words, let's try and impress Henry the Navigator by seeing if we can capture some of the locals. I want to stress this. Somebody was heading back home after doing their work in the sea, ended up not navigating properly, because apparently he went to this school of navigation that he didn't really learn much, and ended up in a place that he never learned. And instead of saying, let me go and find out about the culture, he said, let's go and steal some people and take them back to show our king or our prince. It's just like when you watch all these old movies of these ships that would sail to different parts of the Pacific. They'd get there, they'd go and take all a bunch of stuff and take one or two people, take them back to England, anglicize them, and then bring them back and use them as translators in order to go and colonize the entire area. This was a little bit more primitive than that. This idiot just really thought, let's go and try and get these people. You know how they ended up doing it? It's a very interesting story. It's also mentioned in the book. The story you can find in different places. So Antau decided, okay, let's now keep in mind, these people, his men are wounded, they're tired, they're weak. He gets them off the coast. 9 men, he and 9 men go on the coast and they start following the trails. They couldn't find, because Africans don't live on the coast. We don't live on the beaches. We live further inland. So they go further inland and they're exhausted and eventually get to a region where there are about 40 or 50, a settlement of about 40 or 50 people. They knew they couldn't do anything there. So they headed back in a different direction. Now, they found this man, a lone man, with his assegai, which is the spear, and attending to his camel. And as they saw him, they said, this is the prime suspect. This is perfect. He's on his own. Let's take him. Now, more than likely, this man was a Sanhaja Berber. If you know with the Berbers, they're very different, many different groups. But Morocco has a lot of these Berbers, the Sanhaja being the main ethnic group. These people, you would call them black. I think by the American standard, the one drop rule, they would be black. But these guys certainly look black too, but not as dark as say me. You know, features not as prominent. But certainly these are black people. At least to the Portuguese, these were black people. They go and capture this man. They wound him. They capture this man, and then take him. Later on, they find, in fact, they describe her as a Mores. In other words, a dark-skinned black woman who's also on her own, and they take her. Now they've got 2 people. These two people you would have thought would be enough if they wanted to prove their point. But instead, there's a man called Nuno Tristão. Nuno Tristão is another sailor who's also doing reconnaissance in that same region. He's also doing reconnaissance in that same region. He eventually stops and joins him. Now they themselves, they march along the coastline. Eventually, long story short, they fight a bunch of African people and then take, you can't even see me, and take another 10. So now they have 12 people. Now they have 12 people in total. Of those 12 people, they take them north to Portugal to show the prince. Now, so let me just recap. Sailor comes, stops around the Cape Verdean Islands, tries to get oil. On his way back, they more or less, the wind takes them in a different direction. They land somewhere they'd never been before. And instead of saying, let me go and find out about these people, they say, let's go capture people and take them back. They're later joined by another man called Nuno Tristão, and they eventually take 10 more after killing a few. So at this point, what we are talking about, the slave trade, is essentially an unregulated thing. It's not really a thing. But Henry is convinced by this thing. At the time, the enslavement of African people wasn't seen as a major thing. Now, keep in mind the time period. The idea of going to the Americas is something they're talking about, but they're not really doing it. But certainly using these people as domestics and so on, yeah, it's kind of lucrative, but not as important. Henry eventually goes and convinces the Pope, who's the ecclesiastical authority of that part of Europe at the time. This is still, we've not reached Henry VIII, so the Church of England hasn't happened yet in up north. We're talking still about an early time when Catholicism and the Pope were still very vital. He basically says, the Pope basically says, I give you permission to reduce all infidels. If you're an infidel, that is that you're not a Christian, to enslavement. And he forgives the sins of all those who take part in the trade and the fighting and potential killing. Now, whilst he's there, of those 12 people that he has, one of them claimed to be of royal blood in that particular region of what would now be Mauritania today, Mauritania/Western Sahara. He convinces him, he says, please free me, send me back home, and I will get you 10 Africans in my place. Just think about what he's just done. Send me back home and I will get 10 Africans in my place. What this basically is saying is, okay, for my life, I can give you 10 enslaved people. Now, obviously, what is happening is not what is happening, what later happened in America. There's no storyline where some ruler from Africa ends up in Louisiana and says to the slaver, "Oh, please, I'll swap you. Take me back home. I'll swap you for 10." The minute you arrived in Louisiana, the minute you were put on the boat, you were less than human. So you already see there's a psychological difference at this point, which changes later. So he eventually is taken back. Gonsalves takes him back, and 10 takes him back, and 10 Africans are taken in his place. So we've seen the roots of the transatlantic slave trade. In other words, the taking of human beings for the purpose of profit, the kidnapping of human beings for the purpose of profit. 1443, 2 years later, Nuno went with a man went to Arguin. Arguin is also on that western side of Morocco, or Western Sahara, and they eventually seized about 29 more Africans. These people were literally just paddling along the shore, saw what was going on, and tried to run away, but they were eventually captured. There were then larger expeditions under a man called Lanzarote, who I always thought this was the person that they named the island of Lanzarote, which is one of the Canary Islands after, but it's not. And a man called Gil Innes. Gil Innes, you should look into Gil Innes, actually. These people were doing this, beginning to do this at such a rapid rate that people were saying to themselves, "Man, we need to fight." And Africans were essentially fighting to defend themselves from being captured. So in 2 years, after taking those initial 12, in 2 years, they capture another 165 men and women and children. They continue doing it along the coast because they thought, okay, you know what? We can keep taking these Africans. And by the time they returned to a place called Lagos in Portugal, they had 235 captives. Now, just that name, Lagos, I don't know if you guys are aware, the city of Lagos in Nigeria, what used to be the capital city of Nigeria, the most populous city, I think the most populous city in Africa at the moment, is named after the Portuguese also. But this Lagos we're talking about is in Portugal. So of the amounts that they took off that western side of Africa, and just see this map again, we're not talking about what we would consider what they call the Guinea Coast, which is where you have Nigeria, Ghana, etc. We're talking about this part where you have Morocco, Mauritania, and then Senegal further down, right? So they take 235 captives from that area and return back. So they're essentially creating the seed that creates the demand for enslaving African people. Now, so let's just start this. The trade itself eventually started to begin with locals. Why did it begin with locals? Because, you know, whenever we get to the part of the Dahomey Kingdom and we look at these stupid movies like Woman King and Amistad and so on, we see the Africans that are going, even Roots, we see the Africans that are going into the bushes and taking people. That was not how it began, as you've seen, evidently. But eventually, when this thing becomes more and more prominent, you start seeing these ships from far away in the distance. You know what they're coming for. It's like if you watch the movie Apocalypto, right at the end, I know it's not Africa, but it's similar symbolism. Apocalypto, that movie directed by Mel Gibson about the Native Americans, as soon as you see, after everything this man and his family have gone through, escaping all of that ethnic and religious violence, they get to the coast and they see a European ship about to land. Imagine these people. They'd been hearing rumors over the last few years of these Europeans coming and kidnapping people on the coast. Europeans, not black people. And so some of them decide, it's not going to be me. It's not going to be me. Instead, what I will do is I will make sure that I arm myself well enough so that when they meet me on the coast, I could at least say, you know what? I could do a deal with you. Just like that African royal did when he was returned, and then and they took 10 enslaved Africans in his place. So they were now also, and I want to just make this point. I'm showing you the Empire of Songhai. The Empire of Songhai is the last great empire that we see in Africa, at least in this part of Africa. If you look at how wide it is, Kumbisala is its capital. You see where Tombouctou is. Timbuktu and all those other cities like Jenne along the river Niger. The Empire of Songhai essentially stretches from northern Africa all the way east and further north into what would now be called the Western Sahara, or what would have been called Rio de Oro, the place I just showed you. So this was the major kingdom, which eventually died. So essentially, by the 1500s, they began their decline. They fought a battle against the Moroccans. The Moroccans were actually aided by Spaniards, right? An African king, an African Sultan Moulay, Black Sultan of Morocco, blackish Sultan Moulay, sends its troops over and defeats the Songhai Empire. The only reason, like many other empires in Africa, the reason why they lost is not because they were incompetent, it's because superior weapons had come in. The Spaniards had developed superior weapons, in this case, the musket. The musket became a prominent weapon at this point. So that's why they were defeated. Now, as they were defeated, the Arab slave trade, if you want to call it the Eastern slave trade, or the trans-Saharan slave trade, numerous names for it, had already begun. This is the enslavement that would take people across the Sahara Desert into the Swahili coast, sometimes into Egypt, and then take them for slavery into what would be called Persia today, etc. In fact, if you know the story of the Zand Rebellion takes place 600 years before this story I'm telling you about is. So Africans had been taken long before. Again, watch my documentary on the Arab slave trade. Not my documentary, my video on the Arab slave trade, where I explain just how it happened and how these people moved across. So this was going on. So you already had Arabs involved in the trade of Africans, of kidnapping Africans, sometimes doing deals with their rulers and then taking them over. But of course, even the Zand Rebellion happened because it was pretty violent. It happened in what is now called Iran, Iraq today. But they were also taken as concubines. They were used as eunuchs. Some were used in the army and so on. So even still, as brutal as that may sound, and as brutal as the journey was, it's still not quite what you see in the Americas later on. But anyway, the point I'm making is the Arabs knew how to trade with the empires of Songhai. The empire of Songhai had become Islamic. In fact, this region became Islamized in the Mali Empire. What was called the Ouagadougou Empire, the Empire of Ghana, was not an Islamic empire, it was indigenous. The Mali Empire, this is the time of Mansa Musa, etc., became Islamic and started to use Islam. But they became Islamic because of the Arab traders that would come there, not because of any war, not because they were forced. So they Islamized themselves. And I also explained this because if you see the way Islam is practiced in West Africa versus, say, East Africa, or even in Saudi Arabia or the Middle East, it's very different. You still have women. If you go to the souks, the markets, you still have women there. Not as much, but you still have women there. You still have women being able to handle money, whereas in those parts of the world, it's very different. So essentially, Islam became indigenized in this area. If you even look at the Baifal, I always talk about the Baifal in Senegal. Baifal are a sect of Islam who have locks like myself. Those are very, very, very different to what you see in parts of the East. So anyway, the Arabs are dealing with these people, and they're involved in the enslavement period too. They're taking, and Marcus Garvey's son actually did a study on this, and I think there's a video of it somewhere you could find, where he really just breaks down the sheer numbers that were lost in the Eastern slave trade. Perhaps it was even, I'm not going to say it was more brutal, but the journey, just think about it. If you're a mother and a son being taken across the Sahara Desert, and you are ill as the mother, they leave you there to die. And that took place for 1,000 years prior to the period we're talking about. But let me not get too far into that, otherwise we'll spend too much time on it. But long story short, the Arabs are dealing with the empires further south, the empires of Songhai, etc. And these empires need horses. So they're like, okay, you know what? We'll trade for horses. We'll give you some captives. We'll give you some low-ranking people. We'll give them to you. It's a thing that was happening. Now, in Western Africa, at this point, they were taking up to 3,500 a year. But it wasn't the only trade. They were also dealing with the elephant tusks or ivory tusks, gold, and fine cotton as well. Okay. In fact, Ivan van Sertima's book, They Came Before Columbus, explains that really the cotton trade was really became prominent in the Americas because Africans essentially brought cotton to the Americas. So that's a very interesting argument. Look it up in your own time. Long story short, after 50 years, the trade in Africans, okay, the trade in our people had tripled in size alongside the gold and the ivory, etc. And now they started to come further south to what we now call West Africa, what they called the Guinea Coast, places like what you would call Sierra Leone today. Because this is essentially where you find these trade. There's no coincidence that Ghana at independence was called the Gold Coast and Ivory Coast, still called Ivory Coast today, Cote d'Ivoire. These places had ivory, these places had gold, and further south, when you get to what you call Dahomey, they call that the Slave Coast. Okay, so it already shows you the commodities that people found there. Now, let me take a couple of questions from people quickly. Let me see what people are saying, and then before I move on. Okay, so good evening, my people. Get the likes up, please. Make sure you get the likes up. Okay, where are we? So genetically, so this is, put this one up. Let me put my screen up actually. Genetically, never. Culturally, I would say in the past 30 years. Not really sure what you're talking about. Just remind me, I can't remember what the question was or the comment was about. In the Caribbean and South America, the culture is still very African, but in the US, I can't say the same. Okie dokie. Tai Long. As far as I can see, there are 3 Africas: South America, the Caribbean, and traditional Africa. You can see the shape replicated, the Holy Trinity. I'm going to deal with that in a second. I'm going to deal with that part in a second. Okay. Let me get back to it, and then I'll read the comments later, because otherwise we won't finish. Look at the time, 50 minutes in already. All right, so let me move this. Let me move this way. Okay. So slaving became a commodity as it was in Europe at that point. It was one of the many commodities. Taking Africans was one of the many commodities, like taking all the different things that I mentioned. Now, Columbus's arrival in the Americas is crucial. It happens so his first voyage is 1492. Now, I won't go into detail. I think I've talked about this Columbus. Excuse me. I've talked about this Columbus thing a few times in the past. Check out my documentary, The Rise of Islam in Mali and Jenny and the Dogon. I explained that quite a lot. But essentially, they needed hands at first to work the land. So after Columbus had moved to this part, after Columbus had opened this part of the world to the Portuguese, and the Spaniards had come in to a certain degree, they'd opened this place up, and now they needed hands to work there. They needed people to work in the fields. They needed people to work the land. By 1503, even, the Spanish governor, a man by the name of Ovando, he's the governor of Hispaniola. Hispaniola is the island where you find Haiti and the Dominican Republic, Santo Domingo. Now, those two countries are very crucial because they are sugar-producing nations, sugar-producing places that require people to work. Now, they use the indigenous people, as they always do. And it's at this point that they start to think, okay, let's start bringing Africans. But they weren't just bringing Africans, because remember, there's still a Christian slave trade that's going on. This Christian slave trade, by the way, or so-called enslavement, went from about the year 900 till about, for another like 300 or 400 years, even longer even. But these Christian slaves, for instance, let me go back. So they started to bring some Africans. Now keep in mind, 1492, when 1492 happens, it's also the same year that the Moors gave up in Africa, in Spain. Now remember, a few minutes ago, I mentioned that the Moors, the so-called Moors, had controlled vast regions of Spain, but they didn't control it all. And gradually, they were losing all their different places. They lost Cordoba, they lost Sevilla, they now lost Granada. And it's a famous image. Now, immediately after this, you have what we call the Spanish Inquisition. The Spanish Inquisition is crucial if you want to understand the roots of slavery. The Spanish Inquisition we start to see happen, where people are now, the Spaniards want to make up for those 700 or 800 years of them being ruled by blacks and Arabs and Islamic people. And they say to themselves, let's go and investigate anyone who has roots. And some were put to death. Some were also taken as enslaved people to the New World, so-called New World, the Americas. And these people were used to, because of their knowledge, sometimes to work the land in terms of bringing up technology, but some were also actually used to work. Now, the Portuguese at this point have been doing the trade in Africa for about 50 or 60 years now. So now they start to use these vast amounts of Africans that they're taking from Western Africa and bringing them over to work the land in places like Hispaniola, Haiti, and Dominican Republic. But they're also still bringing whites. So it's not as if this was a complete black slave trade. And what they started seeing as well is they started seeing small rebellions break up. If you know, Gaspayanga's rebellion happens around this time in what would now be called Mexico. Right, Gaspayanga is this African from what would be called Central Africa today, leads a successful rebellion in Mexico, way before 1619, which people, by the way, that whole thing, the year of return, 1619, is just, it's just not an accurate thing. It's not the first slave ship. It's just not. We've already seen this from history that it can't be. Anyway, long story short, white slaves are being brought over to the point where this governor, Ovando of Hispaniola, the man who was essentially governing the island, he petitions Isabella. Now, who is Isabella? So you have two kingdoms that essentially create the reconquering of Spain. It's formed by an alliance, a man called King Ferdinand from a place called Castile. We're talking about northern Spain. And Isabella of Aragon, also part of northern Spain. These were the two prominent kingdoms. They came together and they essentially created that whole, what you would call the reconquering. They became the reconquerors of Spain, and eventually of the Americas, conquerors of the Americas. Those two came together and essentially were the driving force behind Columbus going on his ships and so on, and the sailors that went to the New World, Amerigo Vespucci, etc. So even to the point where Christian slaves were being brought over to the island. So Ovando says, look, I don't want to bring any more blacks. Stop it. So Isabella actually said, okay, cool. These rebellions, we don't want any more rebellions. So she sent some white Christian slaves instead. Now, what quickly happens is the natives die out. Okay. The point was, let's send these Christian slaves. Hopefully they'll Christianize the natives, but the natives eventually died out. Right? If you go to an island like Hispaniola, go to Haiti or Dominican Republic, there are very few indigenous people that still live there. Many of them died out. Now, there was, to the extent that there was even a period where they had white women slaves who were brought over and used really as sex workers in brothels, etc. But that really started to die off when they saw that Africans were really the ones who could sustain this land. They were physically stronger, they were physically able, and this is when the trade began to get brutal. Now, keep in mind, the key years for the slave trade, I know we talk about, there's loads of numbers, about 500 years, 300 years, whatever. The most prominent years of the so-called transatlantic slave trade were 1700 till about 1850. Those 150 years is when we see the biggest traffic. Okay? Now, the reason for this is not just because of the Portuguese. The Portuguese didn't last long in Africa, by the way, because once once Elizabeth I, much later on, decided, okay, let's explore what these people are doing. Because even the Portuguese, they even went to what is called Ghana today, what would be considered Ghana today. And they were so brazen with what they were doing that they went and said to the king, look, we've got the stuff you need, because essentially this is trade. We've got the stuff that you need, and we need your Africans. And a lot of these kings resisted. A lot of the kings resisted. A lot of the rulers resisted. But they said, we want to use some of your land to build a fort on the coast. And despite initially refusing, the king allowed them eventually. And in fact, there's a very famous phrase where he says, I'm trying to remember, he said, if we see each other infrequently, it'll be better. Because remember, the Ashanti Empire is essentially in Kumasi. Kumasi is further inland from the coastline, very far away from what you would call Cape Coast today. So anyway, this is what birthed that place they called Elmina Castle. And Elmina Castle, they start to establish a few more. They establish places like Lagos in Nigeria. We call Lagos. They start to establish all these different places. But the British under Elizabeth, when they find out how lucrative this thing is, how lucrative, because remember, Elizabeth I, she didn't want to start it. She didn't want to get into it at first. But she decided, you know what? Let's go find out. So she sends her ship, the good ship Jesus, under a man called Captain Hawkins, her most trusted, I suppose, of captains. He goes and sees what is going on. In fact, they take some samples back to the Queen of the things that they can get from this coast of West Africa. And feeling that they had a superior navy, he goes back to his Queen and says, we could do this even better than the Portuguese. And in the words of John Henry Clark, as soon as the British and the French got into it, they turned it into a business. Because at this point, people start to speculate on human beings. You know, the British, the way they do things, they started to say, okay, when I say speculation, I'm talking about insurance. I'm talking about Lehman Brothers, Lloyd's of London. I'm talking about the stock market. They start to speculate on human lives. These are the early periods of America. So you could see how places like New York and Wall Street start to become important later. Wall Street was essentially named because this is where the Africans would come to, and they would be paraded there and essentially be sold there. So essentially the stock market, the idea of speculating, guessing, and the Gordon Geckos of the world would not have been there had it not been for Africans. So all these companies like Lehman Brothers and Lloyd's of London, their legacy is the enslavement of African people. So for my black people who've worked there, just so you know, this is what they are built on. Anyway, long story short, they come and turn it into a business, kick the Portuguese off West Africa, kick them off, take Elmina from them, take all these places, take Lagos from them, etc. Portuguese end up in Southern Africa. They eventually have to go to Southern Africa because they just can't sustain it. And it's funny because the Portuguese held on to what little they could get of Africa until 1975, what they call the Carnation Revolution. Essentially, when all of Africa had become independent, or seemingly independent from their colonial rulers in the 1960s and 70s, the Portuguese said, no, we're going to fight. And they fought a war. They fought numerous wars in Mozambique and Guinea-Bissau, even in Cape Verde to an extent, and Angola. The different groups that they fought against is an organization called the PAIGC, which is under a man called Amilcar Cabral, a great African. You had Frelimo in Mozambique. You had, what's the other one? Agostinho Neto and Eduardo Mondlane of Mozambique and Angola. So they held on because the British had kicked them off and embarrassed them. That's why, if you look, in fact, Brazil becomes the only Portuguese-speaking colony in in the Americas, simply because that is all they can hold on to. In fact, to the point where they had two kingdoms, one in Portugal and one in Brazil. But let me not, I'm waffling here, so let me not talk too much about that. But that is an interesting idea, that these people who came to the west coast of Africa and landed in a particular place by accident and said, let's go and show off what we found by stealing some people and take it back to our king, eventually created this enslavement period of African people and weren't even good at it. Because like I said to you, this school of navigation was really a useless school of navigation because these people were never good at sustaining these forts. And the British and the French kicked them off Western Africa. And they eventually end up in Southern Africa. So let me get to the crux of what I wanted to talk about today. Okay? Because the image that I showed you in the thumbnail is about you African Americans are responsible too. So far, what I've talked about is Europeans coming in, kidnapping a bunch of people, doing it so often that some Africans get involved, some Africans on the periphery, doing it so much that they eventually create such a demand for the Africans that the African kings are offered stuff for it. Some accept, some don't. And some eventually say, okay, you know what, in order for me to survive, in this world, I'm going to need to take my enemies. So I just like to deal with that, because this is where the argument about Africans sold Africans into slavery really starts to fly. This is where people like to create the argument. Okay? Excuse me. Now, if Africans are the ones to blame, and I put only here because some people think only, let's understand that the demand and kidnapping of slaves along the coast began with the Portuguese. They physically got off their boats, went to the shorelines, and looked for Africans. In fact, in the case of Tristão, they marched for miles along the coast looking for people. Wars broke out to defend themselves in places like Sierra Leone, for example, in places like I explained in Western Sahara. People, of course, it wasn't called Western Sahara or Sierra Leone at this point, but those places, they fought to defend themselves. But as always, superior weapons meant they often lost along the coast. When Gonçalves goes on the coast, he goes with 9 men. Imagine being so bold and brave, because you have these muskets, that I can get off the boat and I can go with 9 men on a whole continent that I don't know anything about. Obviously, they saw those 30 or 40 people. They were like, hey, even if we shoot all of them, by the time we reload, even if we shoot 5 or 6 of them, by the time we reload, we're dead. So they went and found isolated people. They made friends with some Africans along the coast who agreed to work with them. These are essentially Uncle Toms. And we still have Uncle Toms everywhere. By the way, if you look even if you want to look at the Holocaust sort of thing, there were collaborators on the Jewish side, if you want to call them Uncle Toms. In every conflict, there are Uncle Toms. We talked about the Rwandan genocide last week. There were Uncle Toms. There was always going to be someone that's going to look for their short-term gain to benefit. But to simply paint the whole of Africa as these individuals is just wrong. Now, when we get to the rulers eventually had to go to war with each other in order to sustain themselves. And in most cases, and I would say 90% of the cases, they were so against this that they said, we will not take any of our own people. We will go and take only our captives. Think about that. In the case of Oyo, and I use this example a lot because it's in my documentary, but also because of this movie called The Woman King. Oyo, that is the kingdom that Viola Davis's people fight. They invaded Dahomey 11 times. In fact, the Dahomey kingdom came about purely as a self-defense mechanism. There was no kingdom called Dahomey. If you look at the maps that we showed you one for 1625, 1707, and then 1880s. It's only when you get to the 1880s you see Dahomey, or the 1707 actually. Because Dahomey really comes about when people in that region, the Tofino people, the Form people, come together and say, let's create our own place to keep our defenses. And what did they do in return? They said, okay, any Oyos we capture, we will sell to the Europeans. And the Europeans will give us the guns so we can keep defending ourselves. The Oyo people, by the way, were also fighting with the Egba people. Again, because we're so misinformed with history and even geography, we think Yoruba people are a group. Really, Yorubas are a language. It's a language group. You have Ijaw people who are Yoruba. You have the Oyo. You have the Egba. There are different kingdoms that make up the Yoruba speaking community. So the Egba people were fighting the Oyo were fighting the Egba and the Dahomey. So what you saw was people fighting to make sure they survive. It's really about economic survival at this point. How do we survive as a people? Because we will get kidnapped. It was a force of nature. Enslavement was a force of nature. Now, why this is important is because most African Americans who have this issue, if you do your DNA test, it's very seldom that you find that your DNA takes you to one particular African ethnicity. And I want to take you back again because you really have to understand the point that I'm trying to make here. You look at the maps of Africa and you think, oh my God, this is, like the maps of Africa today are what we saw at the time. Let me just show, this is what Africa looked like 400 years ago. 400 years ago, this is what Africa, the western coast of Africa looked like. Look at how many different kingdoms. From about where it says Oyo, Sabe is a small kingdom in what is now Benin today, but Oyo all the way to the east, every single one of those, except Songhai in the north, are in what we call Nigeria today. All of those places are Nigeria. Just think about that. So when we say, oh, my ethnicity goes back to Nigeria, no. Where in Nigeria? Because even with that, people might say, oh, I'm 50% Ghana, 50% Nigeria. Where in Nigeria? Because even within that Nigeria, you might find that you are Oyo and Egba. Oyo and Egba went to war with each other. So you are also, every single one of you, maybe not every single one of you, but the vast majority of Africans in the Caribbean, in the Americas, have DNA of people who went to war to enslave people. Some were captured, some were not. So my important question, the question that I came on this show to ask every single one of those who have these issues, the important question for me today is, at what point, you tell me what point you stopped being as African as I did? At what point? Because this African selling Africans into slavery, what you are basically saying is that there is some ethnicity that is called African American. There is some group in Africa, and we've just seen the maps numerous times. There's one group in Africa called African American. And all the African people who didn't speak the same language just went and picked up those groups of African Americans. They said, we're only going to take African Americans and put them on the boats. When the reality is, that wasn't the case. They took African people indiscriminately, the white people. They will take them from anywhere. In fact, John Henry Clark, great African American historian, used to say this. If you read his work, he said, before you accuse an African of being an enslaver, check your own lineage. Because you remember, those who worked on the periphery, those who were collaborators, the Uncle Toms that worked on the coastline for the Europeans, going inland and kidnapping, the Kunta Kinte story, the ones who went inland to go and take people. What were they doing? Let's say they promised the European man, I will bring 50 Africans for you today. They go, they get 45. They pick up another 3 or 4 on the way. So now they're at 49. They get to the shorelines. The white man looks at the guy, and because he's not got a nation behind him, he's just an individual. And there are many of these small kingdoms. Ouida, for example, the town of Ouida. If you watch the movie The Woman King, Ouida is the coastal town. It's essentially unregulated. It's not part of the Dahomey Empire. It's essentially there for a purpose of trade. It's a trade town. So people were very independent contractors. He gets there with his 49, and they're like, I needed 50. Slap him in chains and throw him on the boat. That's the 50 that they need. So if this is happening on that grand scale, if he can get on the boat and get to America and be the ancestor of maybe one of you, when did you stop being African? When did you stop being African? Because somehow there's this insinuation that you left Africa, all the conflict that was going on, you weren't all kidnapped, by the way. Some of you went to war. Those of you, I did a live maybe a few months ago with Courtney Michelle, good sister. And she told me that her ethnicity goes to Congo and Cameroon. Now, Congo and Cameroon are next to each other, and she also has Dahomey, Benin. Congo and Cameroon are next to each other. Now, of course, again, remember what I explained to you, there are numerous nationalities even within those places. So it's really just creating more and more confusion. Those two places are next to each other. More than likely, the Congo Empire fought with different empires in what would now be Cameroon. So you have conflict in the sense that the places that you originate from went to war with each other for the purpose of enslavement. So at what point do you stop being one of those Africans that sold other Africans? So this is the problem that I have. This is the problem that I have. Too many of us look at the map today, fail to understand, and this is why if you don't travel, you are a fool. If you cannot get on a plane and go to Africa yourself and see how complex, we were talking about the Nigerian elections last couple weeks ago. The Nigerian elections is not an election like the US election where you have liberals and this and that. We're talking about 400 language groups in Nigeria, 400. Not everybody speaking, not one has a Baltimore accent, California accent. We're talking of languages, 400 different language dialects, whatever you want to call it, in one country, let alone the whole continent of West Africa. So this idea of Africans sold Africans is dead. We are as African as you. In other words, I am as a victim in the same way you were a victim. Now let's deal with those who were kidnapped. Again, I myself, and certainly there were some who were just innocently living in some places and were kidnapped. Of course it happened. Of course it happened. But of those that were taken and kidnapped, the idea that they were just taken as a whole family, so whole family is taken, put on a boat. No. They left their husbands, they left their wives, they left their children, they left their parents, they left their grandparents back home. This is the injustice of the enslavement, is that I can be walking next to a person in New York City who's Black, and potentially I'm related to them. That is the true injustice. I could be related to them, but we will never know. Do you ever see Roots, The Next Generation? Okay, they say it's fictional. It doesn't really matter. But it's very accurate in terms of how you understand it. The character of Alex Haley returns back to Jufure in Gambia, says the name of his ancestor going back 250 years, I think it was at that point, 200 years at that point. And he says the name of his ancestor. And a boy shows up from nowhere and says, I'm also Kinte. In other words, we're cousins. God knows where they were cousins from. Because all we know from the story is that Kunta Kinte was taken from his mother and his father. Imagine how many stories there are. So that's like saying that Kunta Kinte's parents and his siblings who hopefully stayed and eventually had children, they had children. It's like saying Kunta Kinte's brother's ancestors should be asked to apologize for slavery when they lost their brother. So the question is, when did we all stop being African together? When did it be that you became some, on the map, there's this place called African America, and those African Americans were taken and put on a boat and sent to the Americas. It was never like that. They took from absolutely everywhere, and it was indiscriminate. Get the likes up, people. So let me go through some of your points and questions. So please, I apologize, quite a few comments came through, so I can't remember every single one of them. So let me go back to, okay, I remember Tai Long. All right, so get some more of your point. Get the likes up, people. Get the chats, super chats, please. Okay. Correo de Dinero. Very good point. There was no concept of race because everyone was Black. It was ethnic group, nationality, empire. And I always try and talk about this. You see, in America, because of the white supremacy issue, race becomes the primary identifier amongst Black people. Whereas in Africa, My name, in other words, my culture or my ethnicity is my primary identifier. In other words, on a continent of just black people, you have to find another way of differentiating. In other words, if I'm let's say I'm in Nigeria, the first thing I say, what's your name? My name is Kunle. Oh, my name is Honora. I know that Kunle is a Yoruba man and I am Honora and I'm Igbo. So before we even go further, we know that there's a difference between us. So that's the first primary identifier. Now, fast forward. Let's say me and Kunle find ourselves in Kenya, run into each other. Hey, what's your name? My name is Kunle. My name is Honora. Oh, you're Nigerian. Because I know Kunle is in Nigeria, is a Nigerian name in the terms of Nigeria, Yoruba specifically. But at this point, I'm in a new country. So you're Nigerian, you're Nigerian, I'm Nigerian. So we identify in that respect. Now let's take ourselves to New York City. Not even New York. Let's take ourselves to Kansas. We're walking down the street. I see this black. What's your name? Kunle. Oh, really? You're Nigerian? Yes. But remember, the reason I stop him in Kansas is because he's black. So in other words, black becomes the third, if anything, of identifiers. The first is your ethnicity, second is your nationality, and the third is your race. That's how we identify in Africa. But in America, because there is a white supremacist complex, it's not really a complex, it's a reality. There's a white supremacy going on in the sense that white people are the dominant race in that part of the world. You see a black person and it's not about ethnicity. Never mind the fact that the ethnicity has been dissolved from your psyche because of how they made things like language and drums and so on. They called it contraband. They said you can't bring those things with you to this new world. Okay, so these things eventually get wiped out and race becomes the primary identifier. And that's why there seems to be all this like conflict regarding race and ethnicity amongst Africans, etc. And even now, even when we can just come together on race, let's just say we come together on race, we find ways to create more division. There's now ADOS, there's now, what's the other one? ADOS, what's the other one? You know, then this one is a Hebrew Israelite, this one is a this one's a that. Instead of just coming together. Anyway. D, which was a key factor that allowed is that, I think that's a statement when we're talking about the other stuff. Okay. I think slavery is too broad a term. The connotation the word has today doesn't properly describe what was going on in pre-colonial West Africa. I say this all the time. I've talked about this numerous times. Even when we use the word slavery, it's just too simplistic because for a start, you know, the argument about, slavery happened in Africa, it was already going on. Of course it did. But if you use the word slavery as a generic term to just describe slavery, indentured servitude, and chattel slavery, then it's very easy to just make the argument that Africans were doing the same thing to other Africans whilst when the Europeans came. No, it was indentured servitude, not just in Africa, but all over the world. So using slavery as a blanket term to describe all types of servitude, including chattel slavery, is just unfair. So I agree with you. I've made this point several times on various different platforms. European is naturally violent, militaristic, so indeed that makes sense. Okay, thank you. Edward Jones, is this question for Jamaicans, Haitians, and Brazilian as well? Can't remember what you're talking about. Guys, get the super chats up. Come on. Portugal still relies on Angola for any semblance of sustenance. Yes, absolutely. I mean, this is when we were talking about the Carnation Revolution. So in 1975, so the Portuguese, when they were kicked off the West African coast, they went south. And this time they said, okay, we're not leaving. They're not leaving. They held on to everything they could hold on. They took Guinea-Bissau in West Africa and Cape Verdean Islands. Cape Verdean Islands are the islands just off the coast of Senegal or Senegambia. They took Angola, they took Mozambique, and Angola and Mozambique. And in 1975, the Africans in all those different regions went to war, essentially. The PIGC in Guinea-Bissau, Frelimo in Mozambique, Angola, Agostinho Neto's organization, what's it called again? I forget the name anyway. It's like midnight where I am, excuse me. They go to war, they defeat them, and eventually are able to get their countries back and gain independence in the 1970s, right? Portuguese, essentially, when they colonized those regions, they used them essentially as slave colonies in the same way they used the Americas. Essentially, if you look at people from that part of the world, they tend to know, they very rarely have African surnames. They do. In some places, you hear like Jonas Savimbi, etc. But in many places, they used Portuguese surnames. So they essentially used these people to work the land as if they were slaves during the colonial period. So it's bizarre how people don't know the history, but we'll just use these terms to think that it's not as if Africans had a bed of roses. African people lost their loved ones. Their societies were decimated. They had what I call the first brain drain. A brain drain is when the best minds of a country are taken out. Our best minds, our strongest fighters were taken out of the continent. When you see Jamaica and the USA dominating in athletics, this is not just the legacy of slavery, but it's the best, the strongest fighters, warriors, minds of Africa that were taken out, and their ancestors are the ones that are going and creating, designing, become the descendants of, become the ancestors of Benjamin Banneker, and great minds across America, like the man who creates the patent for the computer. All of these great minds were taken out. So this is the first brain drain. The slave trade was the first brain drain. So what did Africa lose? So much. So to assume that Africa is to blame, like they just like this group of despotic African leaders who just decided we're just going to get rid of all our best. Like, come on. Stop it. Stop it. Stop it. Stop it. Okay. I missed some stuff out. Oof. Where we at? Where we at? Wow. Okay. Okay, T-Mac 1979. This is colorism because there are white nations in Africa that you guys never claim. What? What are you talking about, T-Mac? This is colorism because there are white nations in Africa that you guys never claim. There are no white nations in Africa. There are Arab-led nations and white-led nations in the northern tip and the southern tip, and a little bit on the east. I wouldn't even say the east. North and the south. Arabs essentially dominate northern Africa. Fair enough. But if you go south of every single one of those countries, south of Egypt, I was just in Egypt, by the way. South of Egypt, it's black. South of Tunisia, south of Algeria, it's black people. But the people that dominate, quite frankly, are descendants of Arabs and Turkish people. Okay, so the Ottoman Empire ruled that part of northern Africa really until the 1900s. So yes, they rule it, but there's still black people there too. And of course, you know the story of South Africa with the Boers, Namibia, Zimbabwe, what was under Cecil Rhodes. So yes, but these are not white nations. None of them are. As much as they'd like to claim it, they're not. But certainly when we talk about Africa, we're talking about the region south of the Sahara. Okay. Intent is very pivotal to this conversation. Also, intent. Okay, I'm not really sure what you mean. All right, PPP loan officer. Africa is complex. Yes, very true. Okay, thank you. Lizzie, good to see you, Lizzie. Nice to see you. I don't think it's about travel. It's the friction between Africans here in America and Black Americans today. No, my sister, I must say this. I hear what you're saying. What I'm saying is that travel helps you understand better. Travel broadens your horizon. It broadens your mind. Because it's one thing to read something in a book. It's even one thing to be told something by someone. But every single one of us, whether we've traveled or not, we have some innate feeling inside us that, especially when you live in the West, that I don't belong here. So where do you belong? And until you go there and see it for yourself, A, you won't feel like you belong anywhere until you go. But secondly, you won't be able to fully grasp how complex this continent that you are still a part of, by the way, how complex it is. The continent, let alone the countries. Okay, the countries is one thing, the continent is a far bigger thing. They are very, very complex. So yeah, I hear what you're saying, but no, travel is crucial if you're to understand this. It's crucial. We've all been miseducated. Fair enough. Even us in Africa have been miseducated. We've been miseducated everywhere because the curriculum that we have in Africa is largely primary school. I was in primary school in Nigeria, but there's no such thing as history. We learned social studies. And our social studies really was the history that we learned was about the Nigerian independence onwards. History. I remember doing history A level. I was the only one in my history class. A level. A level is what you do post high school. It's one person in my history class. What do we learn? British history. So please, we've all been miseducated. Okay, Lasana Murray. Can't speak for Americans, but in the Caribbean, it's probably due to having almost zero African history taught except arriving in chains. I've just explained, good point there, but as I've just explained, this is something which we see right across the continent, my brother. Right across the continent, right across the black world. And that's why I cannot stress enough travel. Travel, even if you don't know where to read or where to research, travel. Because when you show up there, you will feel something. But I'll say this about travel, though, and I'm this is something which is very important for those of you who are thinking about going to Africa or have recently been to Africa. Don't listen to tour guides. Do not listen to tour guides. Tour guides regurgitate the information that the British have educated them about. I was in Aswan recently, no, in Abu Simbel recently, which is as far south as you can go in Egypt, black land. My tour guide was the color of this phone. This is how black the man was. Charcoal. I'm looking at Ramses' temple at Abu Simbel. He tells me, oh, I'm like, Ramses looks like a black man. I know. They weren't black, they were a special type of race. Can you imagine? This is what the British told him. That these Ramses was a particular type of race. Never mind the information that exists about who Ramses really was and the ethnicity of the 18th dynasty kings like Tutankhamun, the DNA test that was done in about 10 years ago that proves that their mummies were of African descent from Great Lakes region, West Africa and Southern Africa. Never mind all of that. This man felt the need to tell me that there was a special kind of race. And then we would go to places like Elmina Castle. We'll go to places like Gorée Island in Senegal, these are particularly known because of the enslavement of African people. People will go on these islands and they'll speak to the tour guide. The tour guide will say, yes, Africans had slavery in the system. Yes, I went to Elmina when I was 13. It's the first time I went to Elmina. I went to school in Togo and we went to Ghana. We used to go, Togo's right next to Ghana. We got to Ghana for school trips. The tour guide was, oh yeah, slavery was already in the system. Again, if you use the terminology, the generic terminology of slavery, it's very easy to say, okay, yeah, it was just easy for these Africans to just transport Africa. It's crap. These people don't know any different. So don't trust tour guides. Go there and speak to people about their lives. Forget about the tour guides. All right, Liz. Okay, people communicating with each other. Okay, I'm curious to know where you're from. What group don't you find outside the continent? Not sure if you was going to reference a specific group that didn't get sold. What group? Oh, I see what you mean. What group don't you find outside the continent? Okay. Again, and why it's the ancestry.com sort of thing, African ancestry thing, all these things are very, very nice to do. But you have to be very careful about them because they focus on the not necessarily ethnicity. Sometimes they do. I think the African ancestry one does a little bit more. But they tend to focus on nationality. In other words, I'm 30% Nigerian, 40% Malian, whatever. Now, again, if you understand even the concept of Nigeria, and again, I have to stress how big Nigeria was and how many different nationalities are in Nigeria. In Nigeria alone, again, look at this image from Oyo all the way up to Gobir. Gobir, Kano, Shira, Katsina, Zamfara are part of what we call the Hausa Bakwai. If you watch my documentary, Kano, also on the channel, won't be there for long, so check it out. I explained to you the Hausa states that never even came together, even though they have a similar language and culture, but they remained city states, Katsina, Kano, Zamfara, Daura, Rano, several different city-states in northern Nigeria who never came together, even though they were similar. Those places were all their own individual places. You go to the south, you had the Benin Empire. Benin Empire is known for its great walls, 16-kilometer walls they had. Great Wall of China is 4. They had 16 kilometers, 4 times the size, 4 times the length, rather. And in Benin, they even colonized my own people, the Igbo people. Now, even the Igbo people are different. You have the Anambra people, and then you have the Owerri and so on. Those people, even in terms of dialect, if you learn, my children are learning Igbo, for example. Igbo language, the words, let's say two different states, Imo and Anambra. Imo and Anambra are 45 minutes. Like their main cities are like 45 minutes apart. But the way they both speak is completely different. It's the same language, but words are different. That's just the Igbos. Now you want to go and mix that with the northern Hausa states I just mentioned, then the Yorubas and the Yoruba speaking people and so on. I mean, come on. It's far more complex. It's far more complex than we can ever imagine. So in terms of saying who didn't get sold, it's not about who didn't get sold. As long as you understand that it's a particular region. And when I say a particular region, I'm talking about the region from Central Africa all the way across. Now, remember this. We are talking about the so-called transatlantic slave trade, which is largely the Western slave trade. When you talk about the Eastern slave trade, they went all the way from West Africa. They took Africans from the Swahili coast, that's Kenya, Tanzania, Uganda, Rwanda, even though they're not on the coast, even as far south as Zambia. So there's really nowhere in Africa that wasn't touched by either the Eastern slave trade or the so-called transatlantic slave trade. There's nowhere. Now, the northern tip, if you want to call it that, which is largely controlled by Arabs and Berbers and so on, we've already seen from the very first map that I showed you, the map that I showed you, where is it now? If you look at that whole western side where you see Wolof, directly north of it is what we call Mauritania today and Western Sahara today. Western Sahara is where the first enslaved Africans were taken by Tristão and others and Gonçalves, as I mentioned earlier. So really, there's nowhere in Africa that we could start saying was exempt from this thing. There's no group. The whole continent was touched by this. Let's see where we are. Oh, this is a response. I've not traveled to Africa as yet, but I know enough to know that the hell was caught on both sides of the Atlantic. Absolutely. And not to mention the hell that was caught and was dropped in the Atlantic Ocean, the River Thames, and so on. Because remember, when the ships are coming into places like London, remember I told you the British created a whole industry out of this. They turned it into a business. If they knew that their ship's cargo only had to be 15 or 25 African people, what would they do? If they had 50, they'd throw 25 overboard. The sea, the Atlantic Ocean, the River Thames, the various estuaries of the great rivers that exist in the Americas, where African people were dumped in order to just avoid paying a tax or a fine. We caught hell everywhere, but we still survive. Okay, where we at? Lies. Somebody said lies. Scientists have proven that Africans are genetically different from each other as they are from the rest of the world. I don't know who this person is. Who is this person? We are not genetically this. Who are you talking about? We are not genetic. Who is we? Listen, I don't have time for this type of comments. If you don't have something sensible to say, don't say anything. The issue for some BA is the attitude some continental Africans give here in the States, calling BA. What is this a word? What language is it? Find out what language Akata is. This is the thing. I don't know where you guys get this stuff from. What language is Akata? Who could tell me what language Akata is? I don't know any language in Nigeria. With the 500 languages we have, I don't know any that's called that Akata means anything. Tell me. God. But let me just make a point here, right? Because I don't want to appear too dismissive here. Lizzie, I know you didn't mean it like that, but let me just go back to that point. You see, this whole thing, right? And I want to do a show about this. When African migrants were coming, because this thing happens on both sides, by the way. When African migrants come to America, those African migrants who were born and raised in America, prior to the year Burna Boy came out, go back 10, 20, 30, those of you who are in your 30s and 40s, how did African Americans, not all of them, but largely, by and large, how did African Americans treat those Africans? African booty scratcher, all these different things, right? These are how Africans were being treated. I heard an interview with Michael Blackson. He said he was made fun of so much when he first arrived in America. Now, fine. Now, conversely, the recent African migrants that are coming to the United States, those African migrants, when they show up in the United States, they're coming for the purpose of economic reasons. And so, as far as they're concerned, it's all about earning money to survive. Now, granted, there will be some who have an air of superiority about them, saying, "Okay, you know what? You guys act a certain way, and so we don't want you to be around." It happens in England too. There's some Africans look at Caribbean people and say, "Okay, you know what? Caribbean people, I don't." They just kind of blankets because these Caribbean people have been here longer and they act a certain way. They act more like the Europeans, and so we back off. But this idea of people not having biases based off the people in the country already, it's unrealistic. Everyone discriminates. We all discriminate. But to say that the ethnicity the race doesn't trump I think even the FBAs, is it the FBAs? I can't remember which one is the one that hate everybody that's not ADOS. I think it's FBA. The ones that say that the people that no one has rights to reparations except African Americans who can trace their lineage to America, to the United States of America. Now, again, I don't know what part of history we're focusing on, because if you know anything about history, when Africans were first being brought to the New World, they were taken to the Caribbean first, then brought to the islands, then brought to the Americas. They would take them there and break up the trip. It's not really until later, when the US really became a powerhouse in the enslavement, because remember, the US was Britain, it was Spain, Florida was part of Spain, certain parts of Louisiana were France. You had the 13 colonies originally. You didn't even have the West Coast in that sense. So we're talking about France, Portugal, Britain, and Spain that were controlling America. So they would take them first to the Caribbean, and then people would buy, and they'd bring them to different places in the Americas. That's initially. So at some point, everybody has some sort of connection with the Caribbean. Now, later on, surely there were some that came directly. But how do you then delineate or separate those who come from the Caribbean and those who come from elsewhere? So these organizations, when they start criticizing Caribbean people or African people, I'm just like, how? Like how is it that everybody is not connected to this? Now, granted, there will be some recent African migrants, recent Caribbean immigrants, who you could say, okay, there's no connection to that, and they might even have dual nationalities. Fair enough. But those who have been here for 2 or 3 or 4 generations, how do you then say they're not part of the people that built the Americas? Even if it's not the United States, they are connected to building the Caribbean. I don't know. This is where I get okay, where are we? I was with you until you went left. Now we know you don't want to come together. You just want blacks to shut up and just be African or whatever you want, while disregarding others' lived experience. What? That's what you got from this 1 hour 41 minutes of explaining to you that the history comes from the Europeans and saying that we see each other differently because of this problem that's been created. Oh la la. Okay. Okay. T Max says I should stop playing victim. Okay. We all have aspects of our culture, society that isn't glowing. We all are living in glass houses, so don't throw stones. Nobody's throwing stones. I'm merely pointing exactly how it is. This is how it is. It's whether you see, we can either choose to accept the way the world is and come together, or we could choose to look at what people are saying, and because it doesn't suit what we want to hear, or because we don't like how it sounds, we choose to call it throwing stones. I'm not throwing stones. Those of you who have been on this platform know very well that I'm always critical of African people. I'm always critical of African people. But it's funny. Here we are talking about the problems that are being created in the United States amongst Black people. ADOS, FBA. Why? Forget Africa. Take Africans out of the picture. Why is there a separation? The whole idea is to understand that we are all Africans. I'm going to just put this up again for you. This is the question I asked. When did you stop being African like me? We are all the same. We seem to want to forget this. We seem to want to forget this very important part. Okay. Great advice, jealousy, and be fair. Somebody said this is another ADOS recruitment video. How is this an ADOS recruitment video? Let me not even waste my time. First of all, am I ADOS? Am I considered ADOS? I'm born and raised in Africa. I'm African on both sides of my family. How is that ADOS? Anyway. Lizzie, I'm not with FBA. I can't with the xenophobia. It takes too much energy for that. Some research understanding is what's needed here. Thank you. Bobby, right. Brother Honora, good to see you again on live. I missed your commentary. Thank you, my brother. Good to see you, Bobby. Right. Long time no see. Ancestry tests are only effective when they are testing people who come from relatives. Exactly. And this is the thing. This is the thing with, I think I mentioned it before. With the ancestry, it's very important that you find, well, I don't know how many exist. I've never done it before. But you always need to find ancestry that tells you the exact ethnic group, at least. That's the best way to get there. Because then you can go and study where this ethnic group came from, the migrations that happened that forced them to move from this place and that place. It's easier to understand. And also it will show you who they went to war with. Okay? Because if you're trying to divorce yourself from this whole separation thing, then it's the easiest thing that you can do is say, okay, I'm victim, but I'm also perpetrator. We are all victims and we are all perpetrators. Busy Bean, how involved was Eritrea, Ethiopia involved? Okay, so as far as Busy Bean, good to see you, by the way. As far as the Eastern slave trade is concerned, so the area that we now call Eritrea, Ethiopia, and by the way, Eritrea comes out of Ethiopia. Ethiopia breaks up into different bits. You have Eritrea, parts of Somaliland, and parts of Djibouti that become separate countries. But Eritrea and Ethiopia, in terms of the transatlantic slave trade, are not involved. In terms of the Eastern slave trade, they are involved. If you look at their proximity, the Horn of Africa to the Indian Ocean, going towards the Arabian Peninsula, they're involved in terms of trade. There were some people who were actually selling people, and there were also people who were actually being enslaved too. So absolutely. Okay, so that answers your question. Thank you very much. T-Mac is South African agent. I don't know who he is, T-Mac, honestly. D, thank you very much. I appreciate that. This is just okay, so here we go. So T-Mac, what language is that, please? Tell us. He says Akata means lost dog or cat. It's a slur against ADOS. You're still bringing this ADOS thing. Listen, good luck to you, my friend. Bobby, you're right. We have to get past the division jive. As a black man in America, I don't ride with FBA and ADOS foolishness. I'm African in America. Again, thank you, Bobby E. Wright. So Bobby E. Wright has answered this question for me. When did you stop being African? The point is, you never stopped being African. You are still as African as me. The only difference is a space and time that's taken you away from your actual group, whereas I have a continuity in terms of knowing where I come from. But you are just as African as me because it's in you. There's a very famous, who's the person that says, I am not, I think Kwame Nkrumah says, I am not African because I was born in Africa or live in Africa. I am African because Africa lives in me. Every single one of us, if you're black on this platform, you are African. And so therefore, this whole separation has to come to an end. These conversations are never easy. They're never easy, and it's very easy to look at the accusatory nature of what is being said and isolate yourself. And that's why I really started by focusing on how did this thing start and why. How we've descended into ADOS and FBA, I really don't understand. Okay, so Korea de Janeiro, it's not a slur. Yoruba people call other diasporan Yorubas. I speak Yoruba. I don't know what, I've never heard that word Akata. I'm sorry. I grew up in Lagos. Anyway, any other people who grew up in Nigeria have heard that word, please let me know. I never participated in that exercise belittling others for entertainment. Okie dokie. Okay, Bobby E. Wright, as much as 50% of African Americans are of Nigerian heritage, Igbo and Yoruba, that might be the case. And again, Bobby E. Wright, like I said a few minutes ago, when we say you are of Nigerian descent, Igbo and Yoruba, even Igbo and Yoruba, there are differences. Again, Yoruba people, remember I mentioned there's the Oyo Yoruba and then there's the Egba Yoruba. So which one are you? Especially if you're trying to understand this point I'm making, which is we are all part and parcel of the problem. We are all in some ways fighting to enslave others, but also we're also being defeated and taken to be enslaved by the Europeans. So it's really about knowing exactly where. To me, those new ways of identification are really for hybrids, crossbreeds who need to feel seen. Fair enough. I mean, I I've never done it before. I've never done it before. Okay, so Lizzie, so a Yoruba linguist, has a YouTube channel called Yoruba with Adironke, where she does a breakdown of the word. Okay, all right, cool. I'll look it up then. But I've never heard that word before. Here we go. So logic over emotions. Honorable, I don't listen at the FBA ADOS stupidity. I respect all your work. Thank you, my brother. I appreciate that. No, but it's interesting to see how people just quickly they hear trigger words. We have gone to a place, my black people, of triggers. We hear too many trigger words and it sets us off. It used to be the N-word, but now we allow every single person to use the N-word around us. We give everybody a pass. I mean, excuse me for bringing music into this, but why is it that people like DJ Khaled are allowed to use that word willy-nilly? DJ Khaled is a descendant of Palestine, the same people who were responsible for financing the ships, financing the not just financing the ships, but creating the laws that will go into the Arab slave trade and also to the so-called transatlantic slave trade. He's a descendant of these people. But we just allow people like that to use the N-word willy-nilly. That bothers me. And if it doesn't bother you, then there is a far bigger problem than what I'm saying. So I appreciate the comment, my brother. The FBA ADOS categories are, to me, for hybrids and crossbreeds who are attempting to assert themselves. Thank you very much. Most of the enslaved blacks came from South America. In terms of numbers, yes, certainly what came to the amounts that came to the United States were nowhere near what came to South America and the Caribbean. So good point. Thank you. Where we at? Okay. So enough people saying T-Max an agent. My bad. I'm sorry. But from time to time, I don't mind engaging. Galactic Soul, good to see you. What's FBA? What's FBA and ADOS? Okay. Here we go. Here we go. Here we go. So somebody's answered already. Kwame Olatunji, my brother, we need to talk. We need to do something together, actually. Very insightful information. Thank you. Uh, and really, Kwame has just summarized it. We are Africans. We never stopped being African. We never ever, and it's funny because if you look in the Americas, whether you're Negro, nigger, Negro, black, colored, whatever, really these are terminologies that are used to show you the difference between you and the indigenous population. But if you came to Africa, no one would question what you are. The word Africa will not even come into the vocabulary. It's a question of what ethnicity are you? This is my point. We never stopped being African. Okay. Ancestor, the Honorable Marcus Messiah Garvey. Lizzie, which, by the way, I would answer to both, but I cannot do this. Hope, got my ancestry DNA today. 63% Nigerian. Hope, I need to know, does your DNA tell you which ethnicities? Because there are so many different groups. Yes, Korea knows, male or female, I don't know. Let me not say. Korea knows his or her stuff. Egba or your Ijesha, etc. No ancestry test will tell you that. I think, and I think that's the problem. Many of them will do like, I think I've seen one where they do like Yoruba, some do Igbo, some do, just like the generic groups. They'll do like Yoruba, but unless you can find out what that is, then it's a waste of time. Sorry, said French Montana. Yeah, French Montana is Moroccan. That's another one that just uses the word freely, and we don't pull him up about it. But you pull up people about ADOS and FBA. Anyway, we're African. I stopped calling myself West Indian. We are Africans that reside in the US, Europe, Canada, Caribbean. Absolutely. Go home and you'll quickly see that people don't give a damn about all this extra stuff. We really, you're a black person, you're an African. It's a question of finding out where in Africa you're from. Lizzie, I wish black people would stop using the N-word altogether. Other groups are getting too comfortable and that mess travels, and in my opinion, doesn't look good. Absolutely. I will do African ancestry soon. Cool. Let us know when you get there. Cameroon, Congo, Western Bantu people. Okie dokie. Well, my people, if that's that, I'm gonna call it a night. Those ancestry tests are yeah, they might be yeah, data harvested, absolutely. But I think it's a good start. I think even if it's accurate to say a degree of 60% accurate, it's still good to know at least the sort of part of the world that your ancestors come from. And many people certainly will have, like even me, like my mother is from Rwanda, my father's from Nigeria. I've told you this. My mom's a Tutsi, my dad's an Igbo man. It's very likely that even me, I will have some pot. Just looking at the proximity of Rwanda to where the Arabs, the Persians who came in to places like Kenya, Tanzania, Zanzibar. It's possible my mom might have some blood from there. It's possible my father, even though he's Igbo, has blood from Mali area or even Morocco. It's very possible because there were numerous migrations. There's the so-called Bantu migration, which sees many different people move. There's a migration that happens southwest when ancient Egypt dies, if you will, or is occupied by the Greeks. Well, the Assyrians first, then the Greeks, and then people moved back into West Africa. So there are many migrations that happen. So everyone's mixed up. So that's what I'm saying. My African Americans, my Caribbean people, your mix is not that big of a deal because even Africans, and by the way, Africans, as I've said on this show many times, African people are very backward. We don't travel across our borders as often as you think. We don't even know what's going on the other side of the border. So anyway, my people, I'm going to wrap up. Let me see any new comments. We don't have the privilege in knowing our language and tribe. Yes. Doesn't mean we can't. Again, if you find out roughly where you're from, it doesn't. And the thing is, if you go to a particular place, go and learn the language there. If you eventually move to the continent. All right, last comment from Galactic Soul. I will not do DNA tests. I don't trust those labs. They will weaponize the data. Fair enough. To each his own. Either way, you're African, and you will never stop being African until the day you die, until your bloodline dies out with Europeans, if that's who you choose to mate with. That's the only way it happens. Anyway, my people, this has been amazing. This has been amazing. I appreciate all of you coming in. This has been really, really interesting, both the back and forth. Please, please, please make sure you guys like this on your way out. I'm going to be back again in a few days. Appreciate your time. We've done nearly 2 hours. This is longer than I ever thought. By the way, how's the internet connection? Has it been okay? Internet connection is janky as hell. Anyway, hopefully it went. I'll just get a 1 if it was okay. Before I go. All right, one more comment. All you have to do is marry into an ethnic group, and that solves your problems. We have you aren't going to narrow yourself down to one tribe. That's not realistic. Okay. Tai Long, thank you very much, brother. Internet is good. Bobby, right. Appreciate you people. Blessings. Take care, everyone. Take care, everyone. I'll be back again soon. Hit the like button on the way out. Please, 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 those of you who want to support, I cannot stress this enough. It's not easy. The whole bunch of documentaries I'm about to drop on the channel, very, very, they cost a lot. They're very difficult to manage. So make sure you're subscribing. Hit us up on the Cash App. Hit the super thanks, etc. Anyway, have a very, very, very good evening. All my regulars, Lizzie, Galactic Soul, Bobby Wright, so on. If I missed anybody else out, thank you very much for tuning in. Kwame, Galactic Soul, everybody. Blessings, peace, and love.